Hello, and welcome to the Liberty and Justice for All podcast. I'm Emily Olson, and this is the second episode in my political series. I recorded the first episode about a week ago with my super sophisticated technology and realized that I have more to say on the subject of best practices for interpreting the media. In this episode, I will discuss journalism ethics and political integrity. As you can see, my podcasts are more like a series of essays. I have always had an interest in radio, and now anyone with a high-speed internet connection and a YouTube account can start a broadcast of their own. I can no longer stay silent. I am compelled to contribute with my skills and knowledge. Thank you for your patience as I get acquainted with this broadcast medium. Before I share a few more thoughts on the subject of interpreting the media, I wanted to pay my respects to the late Senator John McCain, whose funeral services were held last Saturday. I always appreciated McCain's willingness to reach across the aisle, and I have been touched to hear stories from reporters, military veterans, and fellow senators about their genuine love for him. He was first to admit that he was an imperfect person, like all of us, and I appreciate his integrity and his willingness to apologize or take responsibility for something. I was also touched to learn more about his human rights work overseas in countries like Myanmar and the Ukraine. He is a great example of a man of honor. John McCain is a litmus test, actually, for how far Republicans and Democrats have disconnected from each other in the last decade or two, particularly since the Republican Party became the party of Trump. It has engaged in what is being called tribalism. It is no longer what is moral, ethical, or even constitutional anymore. It's about what team you're on, and that's a very dangerous environment for all of us. As we know, tribalism extends to particular media outlets as well. Some organizations self-identify as conservative or liberal, and it seems others receive a label as such. So in this environment, how can we break through the habit of immediately discrediting reporters? Professional reporters make sincere efforts to be as unbiased as possible and to provide multiple reliable sources. I guess if you believe Trump, you believe that the mainstream media is fake news if it in any way opposes him. Later in this podcast, I will discuss the real fake news. I studied print journalism in the mid-1990s. In addition to coursework in reporting, proofreading, editing, and layout design, I took a class on journalism ethics and another called communications law, where I learned about major court cases that helped to establish precedent in the communications field. Last year, when I saw Steven Spielberg's movie The Post about major newspapers publishing the Pentagon Papers in the early 1970s, I was the geek that actually cried when they repeated Justice Black's concurring opinion. Quote, "In the First Amendment, the Founding Fathers gave the free press the protection it must have to fulfill its essential role in our democracy. The press was to serve the governed, not the governors." End quote. Why is a free press so important? It is meant to provide, in essence, a fourth branch of government and additional checks and balances to assure that government institutions are working properly to represent the people and to protect our freedoms. The United States of America offers collective freedoms that no other country in the history of humanity has ever given to its people, freedoms that some have only dreamed about. Our country is a beacon or a city on a hill that gives hope to people around the world. Our Constitution was the inspiration behind the constitutions of many countries that make up the free world. I don't think that many of us as Americans even understand how lucky we are to be blessed with these freedoms. I am grateful for those who have fought in the U.S. Armed Forces, as well as our allies, to protect these freedoms. And I want to acknowledge two of my nieces, my father, both grandfathers, and some of my great-grandfathers, who all enlisted and served in wars during the last century. And I have ancestors before that, who also fought in the Revolutionary and Mexican-American Wars. These family members of mine know more about freedom than I do, as they have seen a world without freedom and fought to preserve ours. About 10 years ago, I traveled outside of the country for the first time. The company I worked for sent me to India for about 3 months, and in a series of flights, a total of 24 hours in the air, I got to the other side of the world. The experience gave me a better perspective on just how big and diverse this world really is. I was also stunned to realize how much many international people really hate Americans. Particularly in India, they see us as spoiled, rich, and worldly. To be fair, many of them have never met one of us. While I was there, I felt like an ambassador and did my best to be honest and genuine to them. I grew to love the people very much, and despite their caste, treated them all as my equals. I do not profess to be perfect. I have certainly made my share of mistakes, but I do my best to make amends. Early in my life, I made a religious commitment to such attributes as honesty and integrity, and in my career I practiced the journalism code of ethics. When I was a journalist, and I have practiced other similar business codes that many of us practice in our work. Through most of the 1900s, journalists were expected to follow a code of ethics, which is available on the Society of Professional Journalists website. It is not to say that all journalists follow it, but it provides a standard for the profession, and I am grateful to have known editors and reporters throughout my schooling and newspaper jobs who practiced this original code. Old school journalists practically separated themselves from society. They rarely joined civic clubs or other organizations which might create the appearance of bias. They did not accept gifts, and many lived like paupers. The journalism code of ethics involves seeking the truth and reporting it, taking responsibility for accuracy, requiring that those with power are accountable, and making efforts to prevent harm to their sources, a topic that has been discussed a lot this year, as major media outlets have frequently referenced anonymous sources and articles about Trump. Other ethics in the code are acting independently and being accountable to the public for the content they've published. These were the ethical qualities that were important to journalists in the 1900s, but towards the end of the century, the journalism industry and its ethics would face a major challenge that would have them revisiting everything. While I was in college in the mid-1990s, the internet happened. And those of you who didn't live through that cannot understand what the world was like without it. In addition to other overarching changes that the internet caused to our society and to business, the internet threatened the traditional business model of newspapers and other news outlets. Newspapers are a business, and just like any other business, they must make ends meet in order to keep the lights on and the presses running. Like they say, freedom of the press belongs to those who own one. Most national papers have a large enough circulation that they have been able to stay afloat, but many small and not so small newspapers folded by the dozens when faced with the choice of losing their independence or being bought out by larger chain newspapers. Others chose to stay in business at the expense of having a new corporate publisher influence their day-to-day editorial choices. Since the advent of the internet, newspapers have evolved, and so have their ethics. Advertising and editorial departments within a newspaper used to be completely segregated, but today we frequently see ads or other sponsored material on the front page of an issue or on the homepage of their websites. And we have seen major cable news stations evolve too. Most, if not all of them, belong to companies that have experienced a major merger with another entity since the beginning of the 21st century. NBC is owned by Comcast. ABC is owned by Disney. CNN is owned by the same company that owns Amazon. And Fox News is owned by Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, the same company that owns the Wall Street Journal. The ownership of these media organizations has varying degrees of influence over their content, and I think that's important to keep in mind when evaluating any bias you may observe. But for me, these influences are not necessarily game changers. For example, the Wall Street Journal, which is actually one of my favorite newspapers, recently had a series of pro-Trump editorials that clashed with the paper's rigorous fact-finding news reporting. As a lover of the newspaper's well-written, business-minded article format, I have decided not to hold these editorials against them. The internet has changed a lot of rules in the journalism industry. Someone can call themselves a journalist by simply creating a website or posting images to social media of crime or civic disobedience that they take with their cell phones. I am fascinated by the citizen journalism we've been seeing, particularly of police shootings. In a legal setting, this technology gives the witness of a crime added credibility. Of course, an entity can call itself a news organization and can be fake news. During the 2016 election, named Russian operatives have been accused by the Mueller investigation of actively distributing intentionally fake news content to targeted groups in an effort of flooding voters with information to overwhelm and confuse them. And evidence is stacking up that the 2016 Trump campaign was likely in lockstep with them. Just this week, George Papadopoulos received his sentence for lying to the FBI. Papadopoulos, who was a member of the 2016 Trump campaign, revealed to an Australian diplomat over drinks at a bar in London that the Trump campaign knew about the Russian hack and theft of private files from the Democratic headquarters and the Hillary Clinton campaign weeks before the hack was known by U.S. intelligence. In his sentencing this week, he denied that he told the Australian anything, but it was the information that the Australian gained from Papadopoulos that initially tipped off U.S. intelligence, which began the initial Russian investigation in 2016. Roger Stone, a close friend of Trump, has openly bragged about his investigation with Julian Assange, founder of WikiLeaks, which was the medium used to release private emails and other files to the public from the Russian hack. And we know that the same Russian hackers stole valuable analytics data from the Clinton camp, essentially their playbook, which the Trump campaign, through Cambridge Analytica, likely utilized in the last few weeks of their campaign to identify Clinton supporters and send them Facebook, quote, articles and other content to discourage them from making it to the voting booths that November. During the 2016 campaign, American citizens, aka voters, had a hard time distinguishing between real news sources and the fake ones invented by the Trump campaign, Cambridge Analytica, and Russian ops. Particularly people who are not skilled in the field of journalism, which are most people, would not necessarily recognize cues that would indicate fake news. Another component has been added to the broader definition of journalism in recent years: commentary. Now, traditional journalism always distinguished commentary from news. Newspapers today still reserve an editorial or op-ed page for such content, but editors may show bias sometimes in their selection of news stories, how many column inches they give to a story, and how prominently the content is displayed. Bias is a difficult beast that each of us as humans are subject to. For me, I accept bias actually as part of the transmission process. By recognizing patterns in bias, you can discount it as noise and can then focus on the news itself. Cable news programming frequently includes panels of talking heads that offer commentary on the news. Some commentators have their own show dedicated to offering their opinion on various political topics. But the format we are seeing a lot on cable news is when shows mix news and commentary to where it is no longer distinguishable. Sometimes they may have journalists dedicated to providing a hard news brief, but then the show host asks a panel of commentators to provide their spin. But remember, you can still find patterns of bias and discount them to focus on the news itself. Some networks like CNN and MSNBC actually provide additional news value by inviting distinguished guests, such as retired colonels, former senators, former U.S. prosecutors, and former FBI agents, to provide their expert analysis and insights. They also invite journalists who are actively reporting on the subject to provide their educated opinion or additional information about the subject that they have learned in their reporting. These people are experts who can provide informed news analysis, not just their opinion. Obviously, they hold a lot more weight than an average talking head. I have tons of respect for these experienced, educated people, especially those who have served their country and are willing to provide the public with news analysis to provide perspective about recent events. And I find it outrageous that Trump has revoked the security clearances of former federal and military leaders who have provided their educated analysis to the public using their First Amendment rights. They now give this service to news organizations at a greater risk than ever before, and they consider this risk just like that of combat and offer it with patriotism and honor. Long-standing news organizations were hurt financially as the internet created new mediums and changed the journalism business model, and they have been required to evolve as a result. However, traditional journalism ethics, for the most part, continues to be the norm. In the last 2 years, we have experienced something amazing, a sort of renaissance in the investigative journalism world in light of Mueller's special counsel and other related investigations. Basically, we have been witnessing a multidimensional Woodward and Bernstein on steroids. It is incredible to observe the volume of news from multiple facets and perspectives, and it's produced at lightning speed. It happens so fast, I feel like I'm drinking from a fire hose. I want to thank honest and professional journalists who are doing their part every day, step by step, to keep the leaders of this nation accountable and to maintain our country's system of checks and balances. And in defense of the accusations from the president and others that any news on the subject of the Mueller investigation is fake news, I will say that articles produced on the subject by long-standing news organizations, and even some newer web-based ones, are completely legitimate. The articles I wrote in college were required to have at least 3 sources, but many from the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, CNN, and NBC News covering the Mueller investigation include like 4 authors on the byline alone, each that rely on multiple sources. And then unnamed proofreaders and fact-checkers also verify the work before an editor signs off on it. Organizations still make mistakes that often seem to be related to the fast pace of modern newsrooms, but the legitimate organizations are offering prompt apologies and corrections. There is nothing fake about this news, just as there is nothing illegitimate about the Mueller investigation. Trump may say otherwise, but he is biased. After all, the investigations are about him. Interestingly, a topic related to investigative journalism is the methods of search engines. The Trump administration announced last week that they are investigating whether Google has a left-leaning bias in its search results related to Trump or the Trump investigation. Google uses a very complicated algorithm that verifies a website's validity based on a number of factors, including how much traffic it receives, whether people return regularly to the site, and whether the website's owners or associated business activity is considered upstanding and reliable or otherwise sketchy. It may interest you to know that Google Search makes regular updates to their equation. When I worked for an online publication about 7 years ago, Google made a substantial modification to its algorithm that changed the search marketing industry substantially. Instead of looking for the quantity of certain keyword phrases that had been getting lots of hits, Google's search engine began ranking websites based on quality instead. The sophisticated algorithm began ranking websites based on their level of insightful and in-depth phrases, which indicated that the text was written by a professional writer. As the search algorithm technology continues to get more sophisticated, it is being compared with AI, or artificial intelligence. Google's algorithm is not human, which actually may be to our advantage right now. Trump's investigation of Google's search tool has probably launched, if one wasn't taking place already, A discussion within the search industry about the ethics of adjusting search engines to compare apples to apples, conservative dogma to fact-based source-backed journalism. Even if I think Giuliani's statement that truth isn't truth is stretching reality, the statement is accepted as fact by Trump followers. So, should search engines like Google adjust their results to a more reader response approach based on people's imperfect perceptions instead of a computer-generated quantitative assessment of a website's quality and reliability? My answer, only if you want Alice in Wonderland to become reality. In my first episode, I note that Fox News is referred to as state TV today by some. That's because much of the channel is no longer journalism at all, but is dedicated to being the mouthpiece of one person. Anyone who opposes Trump is labeled as fake news, but I can see the truth. Whatever happened to the truth and to integrity? Our original goal as Americans was to form a more perfect union, to be a strength as one. Tribalism is the opposite of that. As saddened as I am by these developments, I am more terrified that we are about to experience another Nazi Germany or something. Please, everyone, wake up. Let's do what we can to stop these overarching forces, to protect the freedoms we enjoy. The things we have been taking for granted for decades just may be shifting. Now is the time to pay attention to national politics so that we may continue to have liberty and justice for all.